It's roughly 200,000 years ago. East Africa. You're a human. Not a king, not a farmer, not a philosopher. Just a regular Homo sapiens, standing somewhere, wondering where your next meal is coming from, and hoping nothing with bigger teeth than you finds you first. Now, if you could somehow take a photograph of yourself and compare it to the 8 billion people alive today, one thing would immediately jump out. You probably wouldn't be white. You probably wouldn't be Asian. You definitely wouldn't be a redhead arguing with the sun every summer. The first modern humans almost certainly had dark skin, which raises a surprisingly interesting question. If humanity started out with one color, where did every other shade come from? Let's start at the beginning. For most of human history, there was no such thing as a white person, or a black person, or an Asian person. Those categories are incredibly recent. For almost 90% of Homo sapiens history, everyone lived in Africa. And Africa has a lot of sunlight, an almost ridiculous amount of sunlight. The kind that looks pleasant on vacation, but can quietly destroy your DNA if you're exposed to it constantly over thousands of generations. Which is exactly why melanin exists. It's the pigment that gives skin its darker color. More importantly, it's basically nature's sunscreen. It absorbs harmful ultraviolet radiation before that radiation can damage cells, destroy folate levels, and cause all sorts of biological problems evolution generally considers bad. And in equatorial Africa, where UV radiation is among the strongest on Earth, having lots of melanin wasn't just useful, it was a massive evolutionary advantage. Generation after generation, individuals with darker skin were better protected. Over enough time, dark skin became the norm. Not because evolution had a preference. Evolution doesn't care about appearances. It cares about one thing. Did you survive long enough to have children? That's it. That's the entire performance review. For hundreds of thousands of years, dark skin was one of humanity's greatest biological assets. Then, humans started moving. And that's where everything gets weird. Around 60,000 to 80,000 years ago, groups of humans began leaving Africa. Some traveled through the Middle East, others moved into Europe, others pushed eastward into Asia. Eventually, humans would reach Australia, Siberia, and somehow decide crossing into the Americas was a reasonable idea. Which sounds impressive until you remember none of them had maps or compasses or Google Maps desperately recalculating every 10 seconds. They just kept walking. And as humans moved farther from the equator, something changed. The sunlight changed. Ultraviolet radiation became weaker. At first, this sounds fantastic. Less UV damage, less risk, problem solved. Except, not quite. Because the same sunlight that damages skin also helps the body produce vitamin D. And vitamin D is incredibly important. Without enough of it, bones weaken, immune systems suffer, development becomes more difficult. You can survive with too little vitamin D, but evolution doesn't reward surviving. It rewards thriving. So suddenly, the very trait that had been so useful in Africa was becoming a liability farther north. Dark skin blocked UV extremely effectively, but in places with much less UV to begin with, that protection came with a cost. People needed to absorb more sunlight, and over thousands of years, natural selection began favoring individuals with lighter skin. Not overnight, not in a few generations. An evolutionary process unfolding over enormous stretches of time. Here's the really surprising part. The first humans who entered Europe were probably still fairly dark-skinned. Modern Europeans didn't appear the moment humans crossed into the continent. Ancient DNA has completely transformed our understanding of this. Some hunter-gatherers living in Europe thousands of years ago appear to have had dark skin, paired with blue eyes. Which sounds like evolution accidentally randomized a character creator screen. But that's what the evidence suggests. Pale skin, as we associate with Europe today, became widespread much later, as farming spread, as diets changed, as populations mixed. A huge amount of that shift traces to a single gene, SLC24A5. One mutation in that gene is responsible for a large share of the lighter skin tone across European populations today. One tiny genetic switch, flipped by natural selection over thousands of years. Not because lighter skin was better, simply because it worked better under those environmental conditions. Now here's where things get even stranger. Imagine two students taking the same math test. Both get the correct answer, but they use completely different methods. Basically what happened with Europeans and East Asians. Both populations evolved lighter skin compared to their African ancestors, but many of the genetic changes responsible are different. They arrived at similar outcomes through separate evolutionary pathways, which means evolution wasn't following a single blueprint. Different populations encountered similar pressures and independently developed their own solutions. The destination was similar. The road was different. Nature is surprisingly creative, sometimes almost suspiciously creative, like it's showing off. But here's where the story gets a genuine plot twist, because not every population followed this rule. Take the Inuit in the Arctic. They live in one of the least sunny places on the entire planet. By the less sun means lighter skin logic, they should have among the palest skin on Earth. They don't. Many Inuit populations kept notably darker skin than you'd expect for that latitude. Why? Because their traditional diet, fish, seal, whale blubber, is packed with vitamin D. They were getting it from food, not sunlight. So the evolutionary pressure to lighten their skin never really applied. Indigenous Australians tell a similar, opposite story. They traveled an enormous distance from Africa, about as far as a human population can travel, and yet they kept dark skin. Because Australia, despite being far from the equator in migration terms, still gets intense UV radiation. The rule was never really distance from Africa. It was always about how much actual UV a population's environment produced. Skin color didn't track the journey, it tracked the sun. Here's where popular discussions usually fall apart. People imagine human skin color as three neat categories: black, white, Asian. Simple, clean, easy to remember. Also, completely wrong. Human pigmentation exists on a spectrum, a massive spectrum. As humans spread across the planet, local environments created different selective pressures. North Africans developed different patterns than West Africans. Middle Eastern populations developed different patterns than Europeans. South Asians developed different patterns than East Asians. Indigenous Australians followed their own path entirely. Native Americans inherited traits from populations that migrated through Asia long before written history. Humanity didn't divide into a few neat boxes. It diversified continuously, messily, exactly the way evolution tends to do everything. And here's the truly strange part. Go back far enough, and every human alive today traces back to the same African populations. Every single one. The person with the darkest skin, the person with the lightest skin, the blonde Scandinavian, the Nigerian athlete, the Korean engineer, the Peruvian farmer. Go back far enough, and their family trees begin merging. Eventually, the branches become the same trunk, which means something a lot of people find surprisingly hard to process. The visible differences between human populations are actually quite recent. Humanity spent far more time looking relatively similar than looking different. A few thousand generations, a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. And underneath it all, humans remain remarkably similar genetically, far more similar than most people imagine. Which brings us back to that person standing in East Africa 200,000 years ago. They had no idea Europe existed, no idea Asia existed, no idea that one day humans would build cities, launch satellites, invent social media, and spend hours arguing with strangers online about things neither of them fully understand. They were simply trying to survive. And yet, inside them existed the ancestors of everyone. Every nation, every language, every skin color, every face you'll ever see. The incredible thing about human pigmentation isn't that we're different. It's that we're different in such predictable ways. A little more sunlight here, a little less there. Thousands of years pass, genes shift, adaptations spread, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, humanity begins painting itself in new shades. Not because we became separate species, not because we stopped being related, because the same species encountered different worlds. So, what color were the first humans? Almost certainly dark-skinned. But that's only the beginning of the story, because every skin tone on Earth today is part of the exact same journey. A journey that started under the African sun, long before history, long before civilization, long before anyone had words for the categories we use now. The next time you look in the mirror, you're seeing one small variation of an experiment that's been running for hundreds of thousands of years. And no matter what shade of skin is looking back at you, the story starts in exactly the same place. One species, one origin, one African beginning. Everything else came after.